Are we good to go? Oh, we're good to go. Everybody's joined in. Oh, there we go. Oh, those numbers are climbing really fast. This is going to be a fun chat. Good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know, my name is Jimmy Moyaha. I'm joined by Brandon de Kock, who's Director of Storytelling at BrandMapp. And welcome to hopefully a very enlightening conversation. So I, for one, am somewhat of a storyteller myself. I tend to occasionally do opinion pieces, tell stories in the markets, and those sorts of things. So when someone with the title of Director of Storytelling decided to have a conversation with me, I was very intrigued. And then Brandon tells me, look, we're going to discuss the middle class and how great it's doing in South Africa. And I was just like, this is definitely something that we have to get into. But I'm not one for lengthy introductions. I feel that takes away from the limited time that we have. I'd like to thank everybody for making time to join the webinar to listen in on some of the insights that we hopefully will share. And yeah, I think the aim of the conversation is just to look at things from a different perspective. I know when Brandon and I spoke about what message we wanted to get across with this particular story tell that we're about to go into, it was very much around the South African picture. I mean, you look at the markets and it's been a torrid time for the Rand, it's been a torrid time for some of our stocks. I can go on and on about that. You look at the political situation in South Africa, and there's often a lot that can get us down in South Africa, and that paints South Africa in a very negative light. Yet, amidst all of this, there's still so much positivity. There's still investments coming into South Africa. There's still strength in the South African economy, however little it might be. And I mean, the whole crux of this conversation is to just see what that actually looks like. I mean, Brandon's done some fantastic data gathering with the team at BrandMapp, and they've really put together something that speaks to what the numbers actually say in South Africa versus what the perception is. I mean, we're often told by media that this is what the South African picture looks like, but it's quite interesting when you have data that supports a particular narrative or a particular side of the story, and it's substantiated data. That being said, this is not my presentation. I'm going to hand over to Brandon, and he's going to take us through just what it is that we're looking at and why the middle class. I think I've asked that question several times, but I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm going to hand things over to Brandon to kick us off.
Cool. Thank you, Jimmy. Thanks for having me, and thank you everybody who's joined in for a little chat this morning. So I think the first answer to your middle class, is that the middle class is kind of misunderstood. The term's bandied around. There's no official definition of the middle class. We started calling it the mid-market. My old colleague, friend Professor Haroon Borat recently did a global study where they were talking about the consumer class, which is an interesting concept in itself. You've got to be careful about how you understand that. But the idea is that there's a group of people in society who have, as consumers, have a little bit more choice than others, right? So somewhere between survival and living life, there's a not too fine line. And that's kind of the work that we've been doing for the last decade. So we're very obsessed with this idea of who are the people who can give us hope in South Africa. I think it's really easy. You've already sort of harked to it, that the idea of being hopeless in South Africa is quite real, right? I mean, we've got potential grid collapse. We've got a bunch of politicians who are basically, if you read anybody like Jacques Pauw's books, they should all be in prison. There's like we're on the precipice of complete chaos and hopelessness, and that's an awful mindset to be in, I think, if you're in business or marketing or just a normal human being. So what I'm hoping to leave you with here is a slightly different sense, which would be, if we are allowed to, if things do change, if there is fundamental political change in this country of some sort, and we do have a better future, do we have the right group of people to help drag us into that better future? Yeah, so it's sort of, is there a rational hope? Okay, does that sound like a fair premise?
Yeah, okay. I think we looked at a couple of ways of positioning this, but I think that sums it up quite well. And there's a very deliberate reason why the middle class is so important.
Sure. Okay, so let's try and unpack it first. There's effectively four things that I think we can try and get through this morning. The first is I want to just show you a general shape and size of South Africa. What does our country look like right now? And then very importantly, is there a group of people that we almost forget about, that aren't reported in the media? And it's the group of people that we believe can honestly lead us into a better future. Okay. Then I want to talk a little bit about one of the driving factors behind what I'm about to show you, because it is a growth story. And I believe that's education. We know, not I believe, our data shows it. And then when you look at the education data, there's a really interesting story there. The third thing I'd like to touch on is rate of change, because we forget that it's 2023. Madiba died in 2013, 10 years ago.
10 years ago. Yeah.
10 years ago, Nelson Mandela died, and it feels to some of us like it was just yesterday. I was sitting with my 16-year-old goddaughter having lunch on Sunday, and she was talking about Nelson Mandela like we used to talk about sort of, Jan van Riebeeck or Napoleon Bonaparte as some sort of historical figure, So I want to talk a little bit about the rate of change and some of the big shifts we've seen. And then the fourth part is a really interesting story about the automotive industry and how it is almost like a litmus test for the story I'm telling. So hopefully we'll have time to get through all four. I'm going to rip through some of this, so stop me if you think if I'm going too fast. So anybody who's seen any of our presentations will know this classic pyramid view of South Africa. So when we try and understand what the country looks like, we talk about it like this. Right now in South Africa, there are 43 million adults, okay, over the age of 18. 63 odd million people, 43 million adults. And we earn 3 trillion rand a year in formal income. Okay, so the informal market is very important, but any money that operates or sits in the informal market has to start somewhere, and it has to start in the formal market. So that's a good way of starting the discussion. If we take those 43 million adults and we divide them into households in South Africa, this is what the picture looks like. 70% of all those adults live in households earning under 10,000 Rand a month. That's 30 million adults out of 43 living in households earning less than 10K. Okay? It's quite a lot of people sitting inside there. You've got 17 million social grants, maybe 15 million individuals. More than half of those people rely 100% on social grants to put food on the table. This is an area of struggle and radically underserved communities. It's the great failure of our politics is that bottom piece of the triangle. Then we got a little group of 25% of people, about 10 million adults. They're living in households between 10 and 40. The reason for the 10 and 40 you'll see in a moment when I start talking about treasury and income. But it's about 10 million people. And then right at the top, you've got this group of 5% of all adults, tiny little group of 3 million people who live in households earning 40,000 Rand a month or more. So if anybody is sitting on this call today, anybody listening in, and their household income is more than 40,000 Rand a month combined, welcome, you are the top 5%. You're basically the top million households in South Africa. What you're looking at there is effectively the basis of the Gini coefficient, right? We are officially the most unequal country in the world. And when you take the 3 trillion Rand and you divide it over those three pieces of the triangle, that's the picture you see. So the top 5% of adults in South Africa take home more than half of all formal income. Okay. Why is all of this important? Well, what we've done for the last 10 years is we've obsessed about this top piece of the triangle. Who are these people? How is it changing? How is it shifting? It was in 2011 that we first did a piece of work with the Unilever Institute, the then Unilever, now the UCT Liberty School of Strategic Marketing. And they did a study called 4 Million and Rising in 2011. It was the first time that the black middle class had outnumbered all other ethnic groups in South Africa in the middle class. 4 million people. That was back in 2011. And we looked at this group and went, sure, if we are to have a future, it feels like these are the people who we need to concentrate on to understand. It's easy to understand the struggling masses. They are struggling people and they need desperate help. But I don't think that's not going to help anybody if this piece of the picture that we're looking at is in trouble. Yeah, that's the premise. So back in 2014, roughly 10 years ago, that mid-market plus, this group of consumers who have some level of choice, was about 9 million. Now it's about 13. Okay, so importantly, the population of South Africa in the last 10 years, not only did Madiba die 10 years ago, but but there's lots of things that we can look at over 10 years. And one of them is we've added 10 million South Africans in 10 years. 10 million South Africans in 10 years. We're now proudly the 25th biggest country in the world. Yeah, it's a really important thing to get your head around, because what it means is that if you shift the needle 2.5% with any measure, 2.5%, that's 1 million people's lives who are affected. You know, a 2% change in anything is 1 million people in South Africa. We're a massive country with a huge population. So we wanted to look at this top group of people, and the first place we can go to understand, you know, have they grown? Have they shrunk? You know, are we in terrible trouble? What's happened to the tax base? Fortunately, we have a piece of information every year. And Jimmy, I know you said that you were skeptical about the Treasury, probably with good reason. But here's what they do, right? On the 28th of February every year, Treasury has to stand up and tell the Parliament what has actually happened, and therefore what they think the government can spend, right? And they publish this thing called the Treasury Budget Review. If you're a Stephen King fan, you'll love it. It's horrifying in parts when they start looking at 5- and 6-year projections. But I go to table 4.6 every year. I'm obsessed with this thing. So it's kind of a complicated table. But if you look at the far left-hand side, it tells you exactly how many people are in what annual income bracket, okay? So it starts 0 to 96, and then the next column tells you exactly how many people. It's 7.5 million people. So there's 7.5 million people who are registered for tax who earn less than 96,000 Rand a year, and they don't pay any tax. Okay, you don't pay any tax under 96. The moment you start earning more than 96,000 Rand a year, you start paying tax, and you can see how those numbers decrease as we go up. When people start writing stories about the tax base shrinking and stuff, what they do is they go and look at those big numbers at the bottom, the 7.1 and the 14.6, and you hear these horrifying stories about the tax base shrinking. And then once in a while, old Mr. Kisvetter finds a journalist who actually wants to listen, and they start telling the story in a slightly different way. My story is very different, because what I want to do is just want to draw your attention to a specific group of people. The guys inside that square are personally earning 30,000 Rand a month or more, okay? Personally earning 30,000. So in terms of the triangle, they're the people who are fueling that top little 5%, okay? And when you look at the next column along, you see those numbers represent the number of people in that tax bracket. So if you look down at the bottom, there are 163,000 adults in South Africa who are taxed on income of more than 1.5 million Rand a year. Okay? That's how to read the graph. The stuff in the middle doesn't really matter. The stuff on the far right also then becomes interesting, because that column tells you what percentage of the total personal tax pie is taken care of by each of these groups. And what that means there is that if you look at the group of people who personally earn 30,000 Rand a month or more, they are responsible for 87% of all personal tax. And personal tax is the biggest chunk of the tax pie, right? 36.5%. If these people are in trouble, then we're in real trouble. And when everyone starts telling these stories about the tax base, they talk about the shrinking tax base and blah, blah, and the rich people are all leaving the country, apparently they're like lions of people at Oliver Tambo. I'm not sure how or where they're getting the money to go to Malta.
They're all going on a plane to Australia or somewhere.
Yeah, never quite understood that one. But if they are to be believed, then these numbers, of course, must have shrunk horrendously over the last 4 or 5 years, right? And if they have, then we're in real trouble, because that group of people is paying 87% of all taxes. In fact, look at the group of people who are millionaires, right? The bottom two, it's 244 plus 163, group of 400,000 people are paying 43% of all taxes.
Yeah, 44% of taxes, yeah.
Okay. So this is where we talk about the tax burden. Like, there's a huge tax burden on these wealthy people. And of course, they're all leaving the country. You know, they're all on Johan Rupert's private jet leaving the country, apparently. But what happens if that's not true? So what I've been doing is obsessing about this and going like, what are the stories we can find? So let me rip you through a better view of that chart, right? If we go all the way back to 2013, non-inflation adjusted, and I'll don't worry about that for now, because I'll take that out of the equation just now. If I look at the total tax-paying bracket, that's what it looks like, okay? So we were going up quite nicely. We were growing sort of roughly with the population, and then boom, 2019, COVID, whole lot of people drop out of the workforce, massive hit, radical recovery the next year. And people who look at these numbers are saying that the tax base is shrinking. Technically, they're correct, but what they forget is that the threshold for tax has changed 3 times in 3 years. It's gone from 80 to 90,000 and 90 to 96. So if you chuck those people back in, actually it hasn't shrunk. It's shrunk because we've changed the threshold. But that's the total tax base. I'm much more interested in graphs like this. That is the 10,000 Rand plus. Okay, the blue chart is showing you people who sit in my little top 2 pieces of the triangle. Okay, individual tax earners. Look at the radical. So COVID 2019, 2020, you see there's a dip, about 4%. That's what we know to be the job loss during COVID. Look how radically they recovered in the year after COVID. And even in the last year, there's been growth, although it's only been 2%. Okay, so the total pyramid.
And the 2022 figure now sits above pre-COVID levels.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. So this is not shrinkage, right? It's not shrinkage. There's a different story to be told. That's the total 10K plus. When it gets really interesting is when we go, okay, what about this group though? If this group, if we've got such a massive tax burden, please let that group not have shrunk in any way as everybody believes. Well, this is what that chart looks like. The top one is the number of people personally earning 30,000 Rand a month. The bottom one is the millionaires, the people personally earning R1 million a year or more. Yeah. Crazy
so
stuff.
Some of our politicians fit right in there. I mean, members of parliament earn a base salary of more than $1 million, so technically they fit there.
Julius Malema sits in there. I mean, you know what I mean? R1 million a month for a top politician is nothing. There are many governmental millionaires, but that doesn't explain the gross. This is a massive, it's a massive number of people, right? And these are the people who are paying 87% of all taxes. So an interesting way now, if we throw an inflationary view on this, right, that is the growth of those groups of people over the last couple of years. So you can see that the 30K plus group were quite hard. They weren't hard hit by COVID. The millionaires were quite hard hit by COVID. There were quite a few of them who dropped out of that tax bracket. But my goodness, look at that recovery.
That bounce back, yeah, absolutely.
It's insane, right?
You
absolutely
completely wiped
insane.
out the 2020 effect of COVID and then still grew beyond that.
Absolutely. So if we look at a CPI, Consumer Price Index, which I'm not an economist. Disclaimer, I'm not an economist. I'm just a humble writer and storyteller. But my economist friends tell me that CPI is the thing to look at, not inflation. That CPI is a more real understanding of the inflationary effect. CPI average for 2022, 6.9%. We had a bad year. The year before it was 4.5. And look at that compared to these growth numbers. Insane, right? So
yeah, so I mean, even in 6.9%, you're still growing above that on both fronts.
Absolutely. The simple statement you could make is that the group of individuals who are responsible for that 87 is growing double that of inflation. Yeah. This is why Mr. Kisvet is not that worried, because what he's trying to tell us all is that every time a rich white guy, leaves Oliver Tambo, there are 3 new to category consumers taking his place. That's what the taxman's trying to tell us. There is something else going on in the South African economy when it comes to this top group of individuals. And this is nothing that I've shown you so far is my data, guys. This is like, to me, this is straight out of the tax. This is straight out of
Treasury and Stats SA and all of the government. Yeah.
So the story we could tell is this, right? We could say that again, back to my friend Haroon Borat, he always talked about the missing middle. And what that means is that you've got a group of people at the bottom of society who are massively increasing in number, who are almost living better lives because they're on social grants. You've got a group at the top who are growing as well, and then they're doing much better than they did before. And then in the middle, you've got a massive group. That's not the middle class, that's the middle of the country, right? What we call the middle class, that 10K plus group, they've been amazingly resilient. And I tell you what, they're the ones who are filling all the restaurants at the moment. They're the ones who bounced back after COVID. They're the ones who still can afford to send their kids to school, you know. So it's a very different picture.
I want to dig into this middle class, right? Let's look at some of the things that make up the middle class. You mentioned earlier that there's certain trends and habits and things you picked up about this group that we're focusing on. Let's start with the education side of it, because you said that was quite important. And what do we know about this bracket of people and their education?
And the education. So we think that we've always had this theory that education is almost the trigger, right? So education is the fertilizer that you need in order to spur any kind of economic growth or any success in life. So we've been focused on that hugely over the last 10 years, tracking this thing. You know, we know that this group of people that we research, that top 13 million group of 13 million adults, are obsessed with education. When we ask them every year what causes are worth supporting the most, they'll take education above poverty, above food alleviation, above any of those things. Education is like they know they're educated and they know the value of it. Okay, and we think it accounts for the radical shift. I've got one more little picture before I even show you the education, just because everyone always asks the question. So I just want to flash this in front of your eyes quickly. If you go back to 2014 and you look at the makeup of the middle market and up in South Africa in terms of the ethnic groups, right? So BIPOC being Black Indigenous people of color as a group, and pink people, which is the Pantone correct term for the traditional old rich white people. That's what it used to look like, right, in 2014. Okay. So it was about 50-50 BIPOC versus pink in the top end. Because of what I've just shown you, because of this radical population growth, 10 million more people, huge economic growth, when we look at that group now, it looks like this. Okay? It's a fairly fundamental shift in the makeup. And it goes back to this lovely idea, you know, when I do enjoy, especially in Cape Town, you know, Cape Townians have a fairly strange view of the world. And they forget that, like, you know, there are only like 4.3 million pink people left. So if you've got 13 million people in the mid-market and up driving the economy of South Africa, you know, they're not irrelevant yet, but my goodness, they're a minority, you know. So it's important also to know that when things shift the way that I've just described, as fast as they do, you're going to see big shifts in something like this, the straight demography of the country. And underpinning it, as I said, is education, right? It's, you know, it's the role of education can't be you just can't exaggerate it enough. This is what it looked like back in 2014 when we take the middle market. So that's the bottom piece of the top of the triangle, and then the top piece is the top end. That's how to interpret these charts. That's what the relative levels of education look like for each of those two groups. So to be a top ender, you needed a postgraduate degree, or looked at the other way around, if you had a postgraduate degree, you're more likely to be a top ender. Okay. So what has happened in the last 10 years? Well, that's what it looks like right now when we measure. This is our last time of going into field. The top end has just become radically more highly educated, and the middle class or the mid-market has also kept pace with it. So it means that your the level of education is just getting higher. It's getting higher, and that's almost, it feels to me that that's what's pulling this group of people up. Yeah, they're being pulled along by higher levels of education. There's quite a lot of evidence that sits in things like the Department of Education and Training. We can see these numbers for ourselves, right? So this is a really interesting, and again, you know, Jimmy, what I love about this is this stuff is like freely available, man. You know, this isn't, I'm not some sort of genius who's
public data,
public data, you know, and we don't tell these stories and we don't celebrate them enough. And I think that's one of, you know, back to our hopeful thing. These are the stories we need to share and spread in order to give ourselves a bit of hope for what the potential is if things change. So this is 2010, 2021, 10-year trend of the numbers of working age adults with different qualifications. Okay. And when you look there, that is your certificate, diploma, degree. So that's all tertiary education that sits in that little bucket. So it's 10, 11, 12, just over 13% in 2010 of the total working population. And right now, it's 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, it's closer to 15. So we have a very small percentage. But remember what I started off saying. In a country of 43 million people, 2% shift is a million.
Is a significant portion, yeah.
So let's rather look at the numbers and look at the correlating numbers on the left of that. Look at the number of people now in the workforce with a degree alone. You know, it's an extra 500,000 people.
And I suppose the only real reason, guys, in the secondary space, that 5 million that's sitting at 9 million in that secondary grade 12 space is so high is because affordability to move into that tertiary space is probably a hindrance. It's not that they don't want to, it's not a lack of desire. It might just be circumstances beyond their control preventing them from being part of the 5.9% in the degree.
Absolutely correct. You know, and remember, we do have 70% of all school children in South Africa don't pay any school fees. Okay, there's only 8% of children in South Africa at school who pay school fees of more than 8,000 Rand a year. So if you're paying more than 8,000 Rand a year in school fees for your kid, your kids are lucky. They're in the top 8% of all students. There's lots of issues behind this. The one thing that's really interesting though is that what this leads me to believe is that education is maybe not necessarily the key to advancement and the key to getting onto the middle class continuum. It's higher education that counts. It's you know what I mean. Just getting a matric ain't going to cut it anymore. There are too many people in South Africa.
Access to that higher education.
Access to that higher education. You know. So when you do the numbers, that's what it tells you. In 10 years, the number of adults with tertiary education has grown by 1.2 million individuals. So we have 1.2 million more highly educated people in the workforce. And the other way of looking at this equation is if we look at the employment rate, and everyone's talking about unemployment, for good reason, but only 10% of unemployed people have a tertiary degree of some sort, a tertiary qualification of some sort. 90% of people who are unemployed and looking for a job have no tertiary education. So that's a frightening number in itself. It's frightening in one way, but how's this for a positive way of looking at that? If we can just turn things around and create opportunities, we've got about 600,000 people in South Africa right now with higher qualifications that would enable them to be better workers, to be highly skilled workers. They're just waiting for something to happen that will give them a job.
Opportunity.
So education is massive. I mean, it's just I think it's a brilliant story, and we cover it everywhere we go. This is the last one I want to show you on it. You know, if you look at your level of education versus the role that you play in business, look at the percentage of people who are chairman of a company who have a postgraduate degree. You know, the higher your level of education, the more likely you are to have a better or a higher position in business. It sounds silly or trite, but sometimes you need pieces of information like this to prove a point, right? So steps to the corporate ladder that pave the certificates, man. And we need, as you see, I think you're absolutely correct. We need to try and make sure that more people have better access to those higher levels of education.
Before we go into the next section, Brandon, I just want to let the listeners know that have dialed in. I see the chat's been quite quiet. Please feel free to send in any questions, comments, anything that you'd like us to look at, anything you'd like Brandon to sort of answer from a statistical point of view. As I said, the stats that have been put together here, the wealth, it's literally 10 years of statistics that you're going to get in an hour. It's been heavily condensed, but
it's a bit quick.
Any questions, any comments, please feel free to pop them into the chat, and we'll see if we can get through to them. But yeah, let's get back to this consumer. So now we know this consumer's educational standpoint. We sort of have an idea of the higher the level of education, traditionally, the better they're going to do in terms of corporate operations or climbing the corporate ladder, so to speak, and that sort of thing. But obviously, this also comes with its own changes, right? So I can now afford more, I can now do more. Therefore, my spending patterns are going to be different. I now have access to things that I may not have had access to 10 years ago, or even before I was employed. And that's where we now look at the behaviors and where they're spending what they are able to, what isn't taken by SARS.
Sure. Yeah, what isn't taken by SARS. So yeah, I mean, I guess the point would be you're absolutely right. It's a new, what we like to call them in marketing terms. There's a lovely little phrase called new to category consumer, which I really love because it talks to exactly the point. You have groups of people in this country who don't necessarily have the consumer legacy that you have in other parts of the world in more homogenous middle class societies, right? So we've got a group of people who are new to category, who are it's fresh earning, you know, and they're just embracing everything. And when we look at the last 10 years, one of the things that's really important is to understand rate of change. Okay, so how fast can things change? 10 years, as we've just said, it goes past real quick, man. In 10 years, Madiba goes from being somebody who's in our lives to being a historical figure. So what are the things that we can find? And throughout, I just thought I'd pick a couple of fun things just as really good examples of how rapidly the consumer world can change, and think about the implications of this for you know, as we go through it. The 10 years ago in 2014, when we 2014 BrandMapp was actually in the year 2013, so technically 10 years, but give or take a 12-month period or two. When we measured social media, that's what it looked like. You know, it's kind of hard to I can't even remember thinking that far back to what we were all doing. But Facebook was already there and it had taken over, and Twitter was sitting at, like, you know, it was looking like it was going to be a threat. LinkedIn, we didn't even bother to measure back then. TikTok didn't exist, and Instagram was nowhere, you know. So what's happened in the last 10 years? Well, think about your own behavior and just imagine how it's changed in 10 years, right? You know, even Facebook has grown. You know, it was, we thought 10 years ago everyone was on Facebook. It wasn't true. Look at how Instagram's just become this massive part of people's lives. So the whole idea of that social landscape and changing that radically over 10 years. And I feel sometimes like we're those, you know, the frog in the boiling water kind of syndrome. It's like, you don't think about it, but our lives have changed fundamentally because of this kind of stuff. And it's happened bloody quickly. It's happened in 10 years, you know.
Just what's interesting, I'm looking at this data, right? And I was just Googling on my side. TikTok's up 30%, 22% on the top end. And as a platform, TikTok was only released 6 years ago, or 7 years ago, if you include this year. Yeah. So the platform itself is not even 10 years old, and it's already seen such a significant increase. And it speaks to your point around the fact that we are now exploring these things at a different rate than we were 10 years ago.
Absolutely. And remember, we have, you know, everything about the digital rate of change, or the tech rate of change, has a fundamental effect on these things. You know, even, you know, let's not bash the government about everything. If you look at Connect SA as a project, right, the idea of trying to get 16,000 Wi-Fi spots in community areas all around South Africa, so that people can go and sit at the community center or sit outside of it and connect for free to Wi-Fi. Think about what a fundamental change that'll make in a community that's kind of on the rise, that has some access to production mechanisms and is trying to get somewhere. So the moment you can tap into this digital stream, all you need is a cell phone and you can become part of this world, you know. So we see it all over the place. The other obvious one, I love this one because you know, back in 2014 we didn't measure smart TVs. You know, it just wasn't even on the planet. Apple TVs, I mean, these things, they didn't exist. The smartwatch, the smart TV. How do you connect to the internet? 70% of people back then were already connecting on their mobile phone. So it's not like, you know, it's not like 10 years ago we were in the dark ages. It's just that it feels like, you know, when you look at that picture, it sort of makes sense. And then you go, how's that changed? Well, everyone now connects on their mobile phones.
Everyone has a mobile phone. There we go.
Everyone's got a mobile phone. The thing I think is really interesting about this as well, look at the top end with tablet usage. And a few years ago, we did a tech project, and there was this really sort of young, intelligent propeller head who said to us, so we said, yeah, but I mean, obviously tablet devices is quite a, you know, it's a sign of being technologically advanced, or, you know, having access. And he said, no, it's a starter device. You know, it's like, in terms of digital affinity or how sussed are you, a tablet is like, no, that's yesterday. So, you know, all of these things change quite fast. Look at the smart TV. Just look at that number. I mean, from 0 to that in maybe 6 years, you know. So again, how does this affect us as consumers when our access is just so huge and immediate? And here's how it affects us. So I just went into the data. I went back 10 years ago, and I tried to find a whole bunch of things that we never bothered to measure in 2014, that are now, some of them, fairly massive footprints in our lives, right? So 10 years ago, none of these things existed, and now look at where they sit.
That's mad.
This is of the total population. In other words, that top piece of the triangle.
Yeah.
Podcasts, we never had them. You know, I mean, you guys, you have podcasts, and you didn't have it 10 years ago. You know, 63% of the mid-market adults subscribing to Netflix. You know, think about the implication of that for cinemas, for TV, for, you know, any visual media. Visiting food markets, you know, it was only 10 years ago the sort of the farmers market was a tiny little thing in our lives. Now it's become like it's the new Sunday church. You know, it's like everyone hustles off to a food market. Home fiber connection is an absolutely massive one. I mean, think about the implications of that in 10 years, right? That went from about 18% to 42% during COVID.
Yeah, I mean, that's driving everything else. The subscription to Netflix, the listening on podcasts, the access to information, the usage of the mobile data, it all comes down to the connectivity and wanting to have a more connected South Africa. I mean, you look at Telkom's business, and their core business has actually shifted. I had a look at Telkom's performance results yesterday, right? And they put out SENS announcements with their first quarter of the new year's performance, and their clear focus is on the SwiftNet business, the BCX business, and OpenServe, which is their fiber connectivity business, because and they've literally now deemed all of their other stuff, the landlines and all of those things we knew, it's literally called legacy revenue that they're phasing out. So even Telkom and the state are acknowledging that connectivity is becoming virtually the most important thing for any demographic, really. It doesn't really matter which age group we cut it across and all of that, but it's clear evidence that the more connected you are, the more access to information you have, whether it's for your degree, whether it's for your job, whether it's for your pleasure. It's really just connectivity is becoming so fundamentally important.
Sure, it's kind of like it's modern fuel. You know, it's just fuel. You have to have it. And as you say, we see it all over. I mean, these numbers are absolutely massive, you know, and the implication for business. Look at something like Checkers 6060 or Capitec, you know, down at the bottom, to go from, remember, Checkers 6060 didn't exist 3 years ago, and now we measure 20% of all adults using the Checkers 6060 app, you know. So sitting, if you follow the story to the point where we're at now, right? All we're trying to say is that there's another picture here, and it's driving this top piece of the triangle. We believe these people are much more resilient than everybody thinks. We think that education is driving it. We think that there's a huge growth in the tech sector alone. You know, if you go back 10 years and you go to the average business and you say, how many people did you have running your IT department? Most people would be like, 2 or 3. Now it's 23. You know, so there's almost like there's a whole nother narrative that it feels like we're hiding. And when we see these numbers and when you start understanding this behavior, you know, 26% of people owning an air fryer, for goodness sake, you know, like, society changes fast.
And you know what it is, Brandon? I think the other thing that we are forgetting with the data is that it's that numbers effect that you spoke about earlier, right? So a 2% change is, or 2.5% change is 1 million people, right? So let's look at the easy equities thing. We're saying that in the last 10 years, easy equities has grown by a minimum of 4 million people in this top demographic alone, based on.
Jimmy, be careful about numbers. So the million would be of the total 43 million people, but this is as good as concentration.
Yeah.
Of the group of 10 to 13 million people, so in the group of 13 million people, Easy Equities has gone from 0 to getting at least 1 million people using it, like 1.3 million. So 1.3 million is a lot of people. You know what I mean? You can build a business around that, man.
These are people that are actively saving and actively wanting to participate in this particular ecosystem. I think before we go into the last one, because I know you're really keen on this last one, we've had a couple of back and forth about this last one. There's a couple of questions that have come in, and I'm wondering if we should perhaps just look at one or two of them, right? So I think from a question point of view, we'll definitely do all the others, and I think we'll have time to do that after the presentation. But I'll just start from the top. I mean, Robert DeForce says that, of course, how many of those people that are earning over 30,000 a month are employed by the state in a non-industry productive workforce? And it's about 1.5 million. So it's not about how many people are employed, but rather what's the productive input into industrial economic growth, which leads to greater exports.
Interesting. So I mean, so the number is 27%, right? So the state employs, of the total 10K plus group, of everybody that you saw on that taxpayer base, the state admits to about 27% of the employment. So it's always been a problem of ours that there's a huge part of that tax base who are not actually paying taxes, right? They're earning tax money. So the taxes that they pay are, well, it's our taxpayer money that they're paying. You with me? It's like regurgitated. So there is a complexity to it. Whether or not you could say that just by virtue of the fact that they're working in government, that they're not participating or not contributing in any way to productivity, I'm not in a position to answer that question. I mean, I'm not an economist and I don't understand that mechanism. Is it an issue that almost a third of the workforce is employed by the state? I would say yes. You know, I'd say it's probably one of the hidden, it's the hidden nightmare in all of this. Yeah.
Does the portion that's employed by the state, let's assume it's 30% for the purpose of this conversation, rounded up from 27 or 28 or what percent, does that include those on social grants? Because it's very, and this is the thing with state employees, right? The state has often tried to just lump everyone together in, I mean, I've got my own opinions as to why they're doing it, but the reality is, my mother who's a teacher, my aunt who's a nurse, and anyone that's in that level of public service doesn't have a choice as to whether they pay tax or not. It's automatically deducted from their salaries.
Yeah.
There are other areas within state employment where we're not privy to how those things are managed, and there's obviously, this is why the need for lifestyle audits has come to the forefront and that sort of thing. But are social grants included in this portion? And if so, what percentage of them would that account for?
Yeah, so the answer is no. I mean, it's not. You know, your social grants is a completely different thing. The percentage of state employee is split between pure state and parastatal, and when you add those two together, you come up to with roughly 27% of the formally employed workforce. But as you've just pointed out, that includes everybody from teachers and policemen, who I think are arguably making a fairly important contribution to society. You know, like, just because they're not working in a factory doesn't mean they're not contributing to the well-being, the physical well-being and the resourcefulness of the country, right? So you do have a lot of those people, and you've got a lot of social workers, and you've got a lot of sort of low-end municipal people, the CCIDs and etc. So that's on the one level. Then you've got your parastatals, literally like the ESCOMs and Telcoms and stuff. And I mean, I was going to say they're looking after some fairly practical necessities, but that's hard to justify right now.
And this is the thing. I think lumped into the other end, that parastatal end of it, is the parliamentarians, individuals that have on a number of occasions been said to be sleeping in parliament, and they don't earn nearly as little as what the teachers earn. But let's not digress. Let's not get off topic, because that's another conversation. Let's take another question. And I think I'm just trying to pull up the next question. So I think maybe the point that Robert might have been trying to make along these lines is we want to see more active and contributing members of the population, and not necessarily individuals that are paid a lot of money to do nothing. Off the top of my head, the post office comes across as a very, very clear example where your board is paid 30 million rand plus, and you're now wanting to slash 7,000 people at the lower end of that post office salary bracket because you need to optimize and get out of business rescue. So I think Robert's point there is the people that are involved and getting across here should be contributing more positively.
Absolutely.
And we agree with that. I mean, I agree with that. I'm sure you agree with that. Yeah.
So the only thing I would add to it is that, you know, let's just be careful though in terms of hopelessness versus hope. Focusing on the 30% of government workers who are being paid twice what they would get paid in the private sector for doing half the job. That is a pretty hopeless area. I would rather look at the 70% and say that's a huge number of people. That's you and me who are willing to pay 40% of everything we earn to keep the country going. Still, you know. So you know what I'm saying? Like let's focus on the 70%, the 30% or 27%. I don't know how long it's going to take us to shed that kind of private sector, a public sector. I don't know. I mean, it's a hell of a problem. But I'd rather go like, let's look at the 70% and make sure they're okay. You know.
I think, yeah, and I think it's not even that we're bothered by the 30% and what the 30% earns. It's the fact that the 30% is responsible for providing basic services, and they don't do that. But again, let's not digress. Let's take another question. Nana Lloyd says, what has been the growth in the group, or in the age group rather, of between 25 and 64 that has possibly also helped contribute to growth in educated adults?
Yeah,
so what has been the growth in age that is, and how has that possibly contributed towards the growth in the number of educated adults?
Sure. So I don't know the exact figure, but the concept that is at play here, you're absolutely right, whoever asked that question. We are a youthening society, right? So we're becoming younger with each generation. The median age in South Africa right now is 27. 27. Okay. If you look at America, the median age is 34 and a half. It's one of the reasons why we've got, why the hope that we have is that if we can just find something for our young people to do, we've got a lot more young people who can be active in an economy, right? And I know it might sound kind of, what's the word, a little silly or a little trite, but it's one of the great hopes for the future. If you look at some of the narrative coming out of Nigeria, for example, which has the youngest population of all, their median age is 18 and a half. Okay. They look at that as an opportunity for the future, not as a threat. And you know, I would like to think that it's an opportunity for us too, because young people do more, drink more, spend more, party more, spend more on clothing. They're more active. They do everything more.
They're economically active for longer. And to that point, I wonder what the stats say about China, because I read something interesting recently saying that the median age in China is actually an older population, and their population is going to decline instead of increase because they had the one-child policy and all of those other things. Brandon, I know we've only got about 10 or 11 minutes left. Can we just get through that last section and then take a couple of questions, because the questions are piling up. There's quite a few of them, and there are some really interesting points that are being made. But I'll let you just quickly dig into this last section and get back to the questions.
I'll try and rip through this sort of pretty quickly. It's just you know, one of the things that happens to us whenever we start telling these stories at corporate boardrooms and stuff, there's always some actuarial scientist at the back who goes like, yes, but is there any actual real world proof? So I'm constantly looking for real world proof. So this is a very quick story. It's a crazy story, and it's all about cars and automotive, right? The cars on the road. If we look at what's happened in total over the last 14 years in this group of people that we're talking about, the white number is the percentage of these groups who said I don't own a car in 2014. Okay. So what it shows you is that there are more people who don't have a car now as a percentage of that group than there were. In other words, car ownership has not kept pace with the growth that I've just been talking about. Okay, so that'll be, and then all the naysayers are like, yes, we told you so. But that's cool. If it had kept pace, I think it's a very good thing it hasn't, because I don't think we'd be able to actually drive anywhere. You know what I mean? Like the roads would just be would be log jammed. So there's something really interesting that's happened though in the car market. If we go back to 2014, there's a great thing we can turn to. It's this. Don't worry about the numbers. It'll fry your brain. This is eNatus. I just wanted to prove to you where I got it from. eNatus are the guys who have the live vehicle population. So in other words, when you register your car, they track you. The only people who are not included in here are people who break the law and driving unregistered motor vehicles. Okay. Over there, we've got a really interesting number because that tells us the total number of self-propelled vehicles on the road right now. And at the top, we can see motor cars and station wagons, effectively passenger cars. Okay. So I'm just showing you that this is where the number comes from that I'm about to show you. If we go back to 2014, according to that eNatus live registration population, in 2014, there were 6.226 million passenger cars on the road. They're now 7.711. So we've got 1.5 million new passenger cars on the road in 10 years. 1.5 million new passenger cars. Again, think about the number alone. That's, 6 million tires required for those cars. That's no wonder 20 years ago, Tiger Wheel and Tire had 15 outlets. Now they've got 100 and something. There has been growth, even though it hasn't kept pace. But this story gets very freaky when you actually look at passenger car sales. So I'm going to rip you through this very quickly. That is what NAMSA, who are the guys who can tell you exactly how many new cars are sold, because they're the regulatory body who look after these numbers. If we ask them how many cars are sold in every year, they can give us an exact number. That's what it looked like in 2019, the year after the global financial crisis, right? Then we get hit with COVID. April 2020, not going to be the best year ever. Not great, hey? I mean, we were all like drinking. We were scratching in the back of our booze cabinets for stuff like Van der Hum and trying to work out how the masks worked. You know what I mean? It was like not pleasant.
Making your own beer at home. It was a dark time. Let's not
dark time. So the very dark times for the car industry. We didn't know whether they'd recover or not. So forget about that year and look at the recovery year. Okay. So what's interesting here is this pattern that you see. Look how closely January, February, March, April, May are. Look how close they are in shape. It's an incredibly predictive pattern in the automotive industry. It coincides with things like your annual bonus, your company bonus, company results, and then also April's always got the least number of days in the month, right? Because it's all those public holidays and things. Whenever you see anomalies like July or October, there's always a reason. So July was the KZN riots.
The civil unrest. Yeah, I mean, companies had to close down factories. They couldn't get cars to their end consumers. That makes sense, yeah.
Everybody closed down. October, boom, we were looking like we were back on track, and October, Eskom hit us again with load shedding. So if it weren't for that, these two lines would be hell of a close, right? And it's about a 10% suppression. So the effect of COVID was it knocked about 10% off car sales. We got to the end of that year and everybody was going like, well, now we're in real trouble. I mean, coming out of COVID, no one's got any money. Everyone's left the country between COVID and now. There's 1.2 million container ships stuck in the ports of the world and we can't get any car chips to make cars. So it's going to hit the fan in the automotive industry, right? So what do you think happened in 2022? That's what happened.
We surpassed pre-pandemic levels. With the exception again of October. It seems as though October something happens.
Load shedding, it's power, or as I call them, power blackouts. That's load shedding. It hit hard in October. Yeah.
In 2 consecutive years.
Yeah.
I wonder if we'll get October load shedding this year because elections are in April of next year. So it'll be interesting to watch.
Quite possible. But I mean, how mad is that? We were looking at that year and everybody was saying, there's so many ways to explain it. Well, tell you what you can't explain. You cannot explain that people are buying new passenger cars if they've got no money. What I mean? That just doesn't work. They'll be buying second-hand cars. These numbers are over the top. So we got to the beginning of this year and we were like, okay, well, this obviously can't hold. So what do you think this year looks like? Looks like that.
This year's been affected by elevated interest rate levels, so that makes a lot more sense as well.
But everything, but it should be below the blue line if everything's going to hell.
Still hasn't gone below the blue line.
Still hasn't gone below the blue line, right? So there's something else going on here, man. It's crazy stuff. And the last point I want to make about that is the first thing everybody says, oh yeah, but everyone's buying Toyota Yaris's. Fortunately, we have this group called TransUnion who we can go and look at. Again, free reports. Go and download the TransUnion Industry Insights report. They can even tell you in a chart like this how many people have car loans right now and what percentage of those people are defaulting on those loans or are delinquent on those loans. So right now, 2.2 million people in South Africa are still paying off a car, but look at the average new loan amount, 386.
Almost 400,000 rand. Well, to be fair, 400,000 rand in South Africa, yeah, 400,000 rand in South Africa is a VW Polo in some cases, if I'm not mistaken.
Doesn't buy you much. Doesn't buy you much. But the point is, they're your cheapest cars, and they're all just around about the 200K level. So this is not a question of everybody just buying down. Something else has happened, and it just doesn't look like it's all doom and gloom, So yeah, that's my sort of. There's 4 quick little stories for you, I don't have the answers, Jimmy. I mean, I wish I had the answers, but something else feels like it's happening, right?
Yeah, we have to dig into it a bit more. But before we do that, and while we do that, let's get to some of the questions as well. There's a 2-part question here that says, what policies would you ascribe the upward social mobility to? Employment equity or broad-based Black economic empowerment? Another study from Sanlam highlighted the lack of transformation on an ownership level. What could enable the change on the ownership front?
Wow.
Yeah, I think that's a very loaded question. It's quite a heavy question as well around transformation, and we've seen this. I mean, I've spoken about it in terms of transformation from institutions like ABSA, where you've seen a lack of transformation, despite them saying we are in line with transformation goals and that sort of thing. So I think the transformation conversation is one that would definitely facilitate the ownership side of it. But to your point, Brandon, I think the data speaks to the fact that the middle class is taking ownership of the things that they have control over, that they can take control over. And that's what the data suggests here, unless.
And I think also, so I can't really speak the transformative thing and the triple BE, and these are they're loaded, properly loaded concepts. I think when you look at the result, which I've just shown you, you'd have to argue that it doesn't. I don't know which one of those things has had a big effect, but something has had a big effect. What for me has had the biggest effect of all, though, is we, and my message today in some ways is, over the course of 10 years, we all tend to forget because we get lost in headlines and we get lost in strange negative narratives, and we forget that we're just part of a constantly moving society. You can't hold the ship back. You know what I mean? If there are more people who need more food, and there are more McDonald's and more fast food outlets being built and more people working there, and the population is growing, then surely the number of people who work will show a demographic shift as well, right? So it's almost like there's a natural evolutionary shift here in terms of transformation that has to happen as this part of consumer society grows. The rest of it, the ownership of business and stuff, is like, phew, that's too hot a potato for me to deal with before lunchtime on a Tuesday.
All right, let's keep it moving then. Sean, who's been very active in the chat, has said China's had an increasing Gini coefficient as their economy has grown for decades. Please explain or comment in a relation to SA. I think that comes back to what we were saying about the population and the age, but also what they're investing in. I mean, they're investing in China. Sure. China's policies are pro-China. I mean, in the pandemic, when we had fuel shortages, China was releasing strategic reserves of oil to local refineries to increase local production. So I think that has a huge part to play.
I think so, and I think also, once again, I'd refer back to my old friend Professor Haroon Borat. He's got a really interesting theory about that I've heard him speak about China. And if you look at China and Vietnam and some of the sort of the most successful kind of growing economies, they have a huge focus on low cost, high production physical items, right? So it's about like manufacturing. It's the manufacturing sector that they're investing in order to build up the country, in order to grow everything else. And in order to do that, you need a group of sort of fairly low paid workers who can start the profit engine, if you know what I mean. And we've chosen to not do that as a country. Our policies are geared more towards sort of the high tech side of things, rewarding the high tech side of things, and not concentrating as much on the industrial sectors and the handwork sectors, right? So in a country like China, what they do is they go like, we're not going to pay you very much, but we'll make sure you can get to work and that you can house yourself and you can put food in your mouth. That's about it. And that's going to force your Gini coefficient, greater. We haven't done any of that. We've just gone, you get rewarded if you start a computer company, but you don't. But no, if you want to start making socks and exporting them to America, they're not so keen on that.
Not so much. So, interesting, because if you look at what the IDC funds as well, that's something else. But we've got 3 questions left. Let's see if we can do each in a minute. Question from Tsepiso. Interested to know why dispute extensive discourse in all areas happening on Twitter, why there isn't more of a significant increase in users. Okay, so the number of users using Twitter, where we see that there's a lot of dispute, a lot of discourse, a lot of conversations happening on Twitter, but the data doesn't suggest that more users are active on Twitter when we looked at that Twitter data that we saw on our social side of it.
Yeah, so what I see, so Twitter's I think that human beings will naturally aggregate towards accountable free zones, and I mean, Twitter, let's face it, it's an accountable free zone. You can pretty much still say what you want and express whatever opinions, and I think people will aggregate towards that. How much they trust it is a totally different thing. So in our data, we show that levels of trust around stuff like social media in general are incredibly low when you compare it to levels of trust with, say, television. Funnily enough, even the youngest in society, the 18 to 24-year-old group that we measure, they still trust traditional newspaper brands, television and radio about twice as much as they trust any social media platform.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's a trust and access are 2 very different things. Just because you can have something for free doesn't mean you trust it,
Interesting, yeah. Ashley says it would be interesting to understand the use of those tablets. Is it mostly for their kids? I think that makes sense. Keeping a 3-year-old busy on a tablet. You know what? Kids these days, right? From the age of 3, they start scrolling through YouTube by themselves. So yeah, I think I agree with Ashley on that one. Let's take the last question from Sean. Brandon, if you think the middle market is doing so well, what are their savings rate in South Africa, and how many can afford to retire or afford a 10,000 Rand emergency fund? The 6% banded around by insurers is overstated, as it represents those with pension funds. Thus, the percentage is most likely 2 to 3% at most of South African citizens. And how does this then reflect success?
A very good question. So here we're talking about a different thing, right? We're talking about the difference between consumer ability and about wealth creation. So I think you start it's a very difficult place for us to talk about. I'm mostly concerned with brands and consumerism. So I like the idea of like, show me people who are earning money, you can spend money. Knowing how to invest properly in your future, being able to divide the right amount of money that should pay for your insurance or pay for unforeseen circumstances, that's all part of the middle class continuum, right? And a lot of these people are young people with no legacy. So it's corporate South Africa's job to teach them and show them the way to live a more responsible life now that they are earning a high income or earning higher levels of income. But at the same time, let's just be there's a caveat in all of that stuff. I read a lot of stuff about debt in South Africa and levels of debt, and how people are very quick to say, everything you've just said is explained because these people are just borrowed up to the hilt. It's not actually true. In our data, we measure 40% of people being debt stressed to any degree, right? As in worried about and worse. 60% of these people, remember, it's a highly educated sector of society. If they are in debt, they're happy about their debt. They know that they can handle their debt. They're not that stupid, right? So be very careful about reading stuff from industry sectors that purports to tell a sort of frightening story that is very good for their business. That's all. I'll leave it at that. I don't want to get in any more trouble. But it's a fair point. You know, it's a fair point that the next evolution of South African society. I'm saying that they're doing well because they haven't gone out of business. You know what I mean? Like, success is a relative term. In a world where we're at war, we're still recovering from the greatest epidemic of our age. Everything's apparently completely stuffed. And yet, look at those car sales. That's what I mean by doing well. Look at the restaurants that are full. Look at the people who are still able to put food on the table. Look at the people who are still able to pay school fees. There is a level of success. I'm not saying we're Elon Musk successful, but I think that just being able to survive and put food on the table still is a measure of success.
Well, that's all we have time for, unfortunately. Thank you so much for all those that did tune in. If you have any questions, please feel free to email them to Caroline and the Moneyweb team. The email addresses and contact information has been shared with everybody via the chat. If you missed any of the conversation, you jumped in a bit late, it will be up on Moneyweb's website later. It will also be shared with everybody that registered for this. We ran over by 6 minutes. We apologize for that, but we hope that you enjoyed the conversation. And yes, any questions, please feel free to shoot them through. We'll get them through to Brandon and the team at BrandMapp to see if they can answer them. But once again, yes, thanks to everyone for tuning in. Brandon, thank you so much for your time, for curating such insightful information, and giving it a bit of color, making it make sense to all of us. I think I'll leave it at that, and we'll sign off on the webinar for now.
Cool. Cheers, Jimmy. Thank you, everybody.
Cheers.